Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
CK Westbrook.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
Very well. I am very happy to be here and excited about this podcast.
Me too. Thank you so much for coming on the show. So, can you tell me a bit about your writing?
Sure. I wrote a science fiction series called the Impact series. And generally, science fiction will start out with some horrifying, catastrophic event. It could be rogue mushrooms or Skynet or a comet or another kind of virus, and it will change the world. In my series, the catastrophic event is very unique. It's when almost every gun owner in the world turns their weapon on themselves in a terrifying 15-minute window. It's a catastrophic global mass shooting. So total panic and chaos in the world. And a hero rises up and she has to figure out how it happened, why it happened, and if she can stop more global violence. So that's the basic premise of this science fiction series. And I wrote it during the pandemic. So it's kind of like a dark and scary time. And that is really channeled into the stories.
That sounds absolutely amazing. I would love to read that book. Would you like to speak a little bit more on what it was like writing this during that pandemic and kind of channeling it into creative work?
Sure. I should say too that it's a series. So the Impact series has 3 books. The first one is The Shooting, which is where the big catastrophic event happens. And that one was published in March of 2022. The second book was Collision, and it was published in September of 2022. And the third book, Judgment, was published in March of 2023. So The Shooting, it was, the pandemic had just started. And we all had a lot more free time, at least those of us who they just switched to working from home did. And so I was started there was all this anxiety about where what was going to happen with the virus. We didn't even remember how it spread at first. And I had been attending in a lot of protests against gun violence with March for Our Lives. And I live in Washington, D.C. and work in Washington, D.C. So there was, this whole frustration and anger about the mass shootings that continue to happen everywhere all the time. And so I started writing and kind of combining how scary the world was at the time. And it just the story just poured out of me. And then with Collision, which is a little bit a lot of times with science fiction, right? It's always a little bit of foreshadowing or something's going to happen because there is a collision which deals with Kessler syndrome, which is about space debris, of which there are 130 million pieces of space debris in low Earth orbit. And that's a lot of the science fiction. Well, it's all science fiction. But and during the pandemic, we started having launches constantly. And that's when Bezos and Elon Musk and people started going up to the first space tourism. So it was interesting because I wrote the Shooting and Collision before all this stuff happened necessarily with the space. And then Judgment is the third book, and I don't want to give that away. But just the basic thing is someone's judging someone for a lot of bad behavior. And it's totally science fiction, but there's 2 different kinds of science fiction. There's several different kinds, but in general, other world building, Dune and Star Wars and Star Trek and things where you very seldomly come back to Earth, if at all. And then there's Our World But For, which is kind of like our world except for this catastrophe or this.
It's more speculative fiction too. You get more speculative fiction can be the other genre as well, but a lot of it you get in that kind of science fiction, like Our World But For stuff too.
Exactly. Because I like both kinds, but I kind of like Our World But For more. Mm-hmm. And then, because again, it can take into these issues that are so timely, right? Like gun violence and Kessler syndrome. And I don't think even 5 years, no, not even 2 years ago, did the average American even think about the Kessler syndrome or space debris. And now it's this very serious concern. It should have been a very serious concern when it gets started. But finally, there's an awakening to the fact that there is a consequence to these constant launches and these thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit. And this International Space Station has had to move several times now because of debris. So I think it's entering the American consciousness as yet another place we've gone and polluted.
Yeah, of course. that is what we do here. Yeah. And I think that's part of why science fiction is so important, though, is to go into those subjects and to really like shine light on these things that maybe people aren't focused on as much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, on your website, I saw that you are very passionate about environmentalism. And I mean, that's coming across here. Would you like to talk about that a little bit and how does that appear in your writing?
Sure. I have worked in DC for decades on policy and legislation as an activist, an advocate, a lobbyist, and on climate change, clean water, oceans. My most passionate law that I worked on and is the Endangered Species Act, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And I'm very committed to saving wildlife and nature, both because it has the right to live and survive, and also because humans need it. So we are completely interdependent on nature for our survival. So yes, throughout all the novels, there is elements of environmental protection, because again, I feel like we pollute the oceans, we pollute water, we pollute, everything. We have plastic pollutions all over the world, global warming, biodiversity extinction crisis. Then we kind of just took it to the next level, which is space. So we just seem like we are just determined to not clean up after ourselves. And then even when we know the consequences of doing so are pretty severe, it's complicated because the industries that cause the pollution don't want to be regulated. And it doesn't matter if it's SpaceX or oil and gas or plastics. And then they are rich and powerful, so they tend to own the politicians. It's a very complicated system, and it's also the same old story getting repeated over and over and over again. And then just backing up a little bit more on guns, when I would go to these protests, and a lot of times people would say, oh, we're never going to get rid of the guns. We're never, ever going to get rid of the guns. So what's the point in even trying? We're never getting, and I got so tired of hearing that. So I let my imagination find a way to get rid of the guns. So I thought, a global mass shooting would make people stop and think about guns in a different way. And also maybe, hopefully, start to think about like what really makes us safe and what we think makes us safe. Because people think guns make them safe, but they don't. Guns with households with guns,
it
more
makes
guns,
it so much more
violence.
dangerous in 99% of cases. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And then what really makes us safe is clean air, clean water, healthy, sustainable biodiversity, the things that we seem like we don't value very much.
Oh, yeah.
As a society, not as individuals, but as a society, not so much.
And what you're talking about with saying that, like, we're now kind of going on to pollute space and stuff, it's like that whole idea. I hear people say this all the time where they're like, oh, well, once Earth is trashed, we'll just go to the moon. And they say it like kind of joking, but that's a very real threat, that it's like, well, if we pollute all of these other planets and we're polluting our planet and we're just in a cycle of destruction, like that's nothing good will come from that for anyone or any place.
Right. And going like, it's very frustrating because we're spending so much money and so much brilliance, intellectual curiosity on going into space. And I just keep thinking, like, why don't we just clean up and take care of things here? Because if we go to Mars, if we go to the moon, we need to take oxygen, we need to take water, we need to take food, we need to take all the natural resources that we need to survive with us. And if we are abusing it and running out of it on Earth, why on earth would we have enough to take someplace else to start like another life? It's like funny listening to people talk about, we're going to like, well, when Elon Musk is like colonize Mars, which is a really offensive word anyway, but he's like joking like, well, we'll get there. Oh, we have to bring trees. Oh, we need to bring a lot of trees because we need the trees to make oxygen. Well, like, look, why don't we save some trees here? Because we really need a stable ecosystem and environment for everyone. And, it's only the rich people that are going to go. And also, it's a little ridiculous. You're talking 30, 40, 100 years out for getting past the moon for regular people and rich, special people, not regular people. And by then,
what happens here when the wealthy, like that 1%, has taken trees and oxygen and all of these natural resources away from us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, even like, Elon Musk, like with his Boca Chica in Texas, when he blew up the launch pad, this happened like 6 months ago. there was so much debris went into a national wildlife refuge that has endangered species, and he didn't care. It went into people, communities, especially low income people, which he certainly does not care about. And like just kind of that like cocky abuse of nature and this arrogance that we have towards what is really valuable and what is not. It's just, and people keep getting caught up in it. Even totally people I know, friends are like, yeah, space is so awesome. And I'm like, okay, are you thinking about Star Trek and Star Wars and like how sexy and fun it is? Or like really think hard for a minute about what we're actually doing, the money, the resources. Also, I mean, just the Kessler syndrome too. There are over what did I say? It's like 130 million little pieces of stuff floating around a low Earth orbit, and some of it's huge. At 17,000 miles per hour, there's going to be a massive accident, and then one thing ricochets off another thing, which ricochets off another thing, which is what causes like these. That's what the syndrome, Kessler syndrome, is. And when it happens, so many people are going to act like they didn't know. You know, like the news is going to present it as though it's shocking, and it's going to be like, no, everybody knew that this could happen.
We just ignored it.
But we just don't want to look at it. We don't want to ask the hard questions. And I think, again, these are what my books are about. It's like the consequences of inaction, the consequences of, choices that we all make, the government makes, and then, being held responsible for the consequences.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. One of my questions that I was going to ask was if you had a certain type of character or story that you find yourself drawn towards, and I feel like it's kind of in line with this too, and at least from what you're describing.
Right. These books are like, they're very suspenseful, like page turners, which, I enjoy when I write. And they're also kind of pandemic written books. Like, I feel like we all had a shorter attention span for like the 2 or 3 years in there because of just the high stress levels that are happening, the ambient stress, I should say, that was happening because of the pandemic and what it does to the economy and all the other worries we had. But the characters in the book, it's very character driven. Kate and the people that she works with. And then the gun debate issue is intertwined throughout all the books. And it's kind of like different characters take different positions or represent military or suicide or, murder or safety. So different people have different, because guns is a very passionate issue in the United States, right? It's very emotional. So I think it almost all the different representations of the gun debate, including the Second Amendment, are intertwined while the story is running through. So it's, like I said, it's very character driven, but it's also very suspenseful. And I like books like that. Like, I love when I read learning. So, I read a lot of nonfiction, but I love fiction. So I like being able to read and learn. And I think that the series does that.
That is so cool. Yeah, it's another question actually answers something else. I was going to ask what you look for when you're reading. And I love that reading, because reading and learning go so hand in hand within fiction. And I think people a lot of times associate it with nonfiction, especially in schools and in raising people. It's like, oh, well, you read this fiction to read, to learn how to read, but you're not reading it to learn about these broader subjects or political things or states of the world, even though it's all there, especially in things like dystopian or science fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say too that people, it was that intellectual thing where, nonfiction is more intellectual. Mm-hmm. But fiction stays with you. And also fiction, like, I feel like we learn things about people. Like, nonfiction is often factual. Here's what a biodiversity extinction crisis is. Here's what the Kessler syndrome is. Here's what climate change is. Here's what, feminism is. But then fiction is just more fun because it's characters and you get vested in them and you care about them. And that's what makes reading fun. And, like one of the greatest things in the world to be doing at any given time.
Oh, yeah. Were you always interested in reading and writing when you were younger? Or is that something that came to you later in life?
Reading, absolutely. I read my whole life. My family everybody reads all the time. And I feel like at any given minute in my life, I was reading at least one book, right? So, and then my to be read list is always huge. And as now I know so many authors and I'm always like, oh my God, I'm gonna read that book. So it gets higher and higher. I'm sure doing a podcast like this.
You know what? Same thing.
Because you just hear about all these things and you just wish there was more time. But but writing, not so much. I think I wrote a couple of things at different times in my life, but just never thought they'd really go anywhere. And I said, I'll get back to it and edit it or work on it. I never thought of myself as a writer, but like I said, when the pandemic hit and this story just poured out of me, and I was like, I need this story to get out in the world. And that gives you gave me the confidence and the persistence to send it to, agents and publishers and, the whole thing. I was like, I'll self-publish. I was totally willing to do that. And I started doing research. That's actually really hard. Self-publishing is as hard as publishing. It's just hard in different ways, right? So that kind of I was like, I'm going to get this out there. So and then suddenly I'm like, I'm a writer.
Yeah, that's a question I ask in this show a lot of times is what was your I'm a writer moment? Did you have one specific moment like that, or was it a collection of things, or when did that hit you?
I think it hit me literally when I opened the box with the shooting, and I had the book in my hand. So, because it goes through the process with the cover and the process with different rounds of editing, and then there's formatting, and then the publisher does all these different things. When I had it in my hand, I was like, oh my God, I wrote a book. I'm an author. This is like a dream come true that I don't even know that I had. I think it was just somewhere in my subconscious because, we're working and focusing, and I would write a lot for my job. But again, that had to be factually correct, no emotions, because, if in the environmental world, if you get emotional, then somehow you've reduced your impact, which I actually really counter that narrative now, because I think that people need to feel emotions and passionate about something, or they won't do anything. I don't think just facts and research reports motivates people to change.
And most people aren't, and I say this also as most people, we're not usually reading those more scientific things where it's detailing all of these issues out. You're going to be drawn towards the things that have emotions and show passion and can connect with you on a more human level.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely. And recently too, I think in the advocacy world, storytelling has become more prevalent and also encouraged. Whereas I think it used to be we used to have this very specific way we had to communicate facts, figures, facts. But nowadays, I think it's because of the young people coming into the climate change world and into the environmental community and into the gun violence issue. And they have a lot more passion, and it's more cut to the chase, cut out the BS, if I can say that. And I think that's kind of permeating into advocacy all over the place. And I feel like my books are like me advocating, but in a more fun, entertaining way.
Yeah, for sure. So in the future, when you're writing, do you think that you'll still have these in mind, or are you planning on writing more books in this series or in another series, or how do you think that's going to look for you?
So the fourth book, it's called The Aftermath, and it's going to be published as part of the Impact series in next year. I think it's April or May. We don't have a
Congratulations.
Thank you. 2024, and it's 5 years after the shooting. So it's are we in a dystopian world? I mean, hundreds of millions of people have died. Or are we in a better world? I mean, it's so it's has different characters. It's kind of standalone, but it's 5 years after the shooting. And then when I finished that one, I started thinking what else led up to the shooting? What were all the parts and pieces that got into place that created the shooting, the collision, and then the judgment. So now I'm kind of writing prequels, I guess you could call them, but I'm going to try to make this little part kind of standalone too, just because I don't want people to feel like they have to commit to so many books, because some people love that and some people think that's too much of a commitment. So I'm the three go together. But these other two that I'm working on now are kind of what set the stage for these to happen. So I am still moving with this world because I don't want to leave it yet. And it just seems like there's much more to tell. And then when I'm not obsessing on this, when I write and then I have more space, I can see if I want to do something else. But for right now, this is what I'm doing.
That is fantastic. All right. This is So have you ever had a moment in your writing where you had to absolutely kill your darlings? Do you have a good story for one of these where it was you had written something, you loved it, and then you're like, I have to cut it though. It has to be gone.
Do you mean like a character?
A character or a scene or a plot line. I've had people who've answered that question by saying that they had to get rid of an entire book. Um,
Not yet. I will say I've had a because I feel like the shooting and collision and even judgment just kind of poured out. It was like I had to write so fast to keep up with everything, and then I was just like speaking into my phone. So because I was like, oh, here's a great dialogue scene. So it was like it was weird. It was almost like they wrote themselves.
oh, that's
The
cool.
it was weird and it was awesome. The judgment, I mean, aftermath had a little bit more stuff that was happening, like characters pushing other characters out of the way. So in a way, yes, but in a way, I felt like they were doing it, not me. And
Mm.
then in the books I'm working on now, I'm actually working on a character that might die, and I haven't had that yet. Like there's a lot of heartbreak and darkness, especially in the shooting, and then it gets a little bit not lighter. I don't want to say, but not as dark. So the other ones, I'm like trying to think like not as dark, but then I'm like, oh my gosh, this person might die. So I feel like once that's done, I will be like, yes, I'm having one of those feelings where should I be doing this? And also
Yeah.
I'll wait until I feel at peace with it, because it's weird, right? To kill off somebody that you've been working with.
That's such a hard part in writing too, when you love a character and there's a betrayal or a death or something. It's like, wait, no, you're not supposed to be doing that though. I didn't want you to do that. How does writing look for you? Is it generally like the characters are doing things and you're writing it, or do you have a little more control? I know it's very different for every author.
I think the characters are doing things, because even I was like running yesterday and I was like, and I just had this whole scene just like popped into my head for this one part of the books I'm working on right now. And I got home and I just had to write. And I know exactly where it's going to be, but I haven't written to there yet. So I do that too. Like I write scenes and then move them around. I don't do outlines. I mean, a little bit now because there's so many books that I have to like keep things connected.
Yeah.
But I know there's a thing, at least where they say, are you a planner or a pantser? And I'm definitely
Yeah.
a pantser, because like I just, and sometimes a scene, I feel like it's bogging down and I'm not exactly sure, like I can't see where they want to go. So I'll put that aside and then I'll go work on something else for a little bit, and then that one will spring up. I mean, I know it all comes from my own imagination, but I really honestly feel sometimes like the characters are doing it.
You know what? I am the same exact way. I totally get it. Well, that language is perfect because as we're recording this right now, we are in NaNoWriMo season. Have you ever done NaNoWriMo for any of your books, or would you consider doing that in the future?
What is that?
Oh, it is National Novel Writing Month. So it's the challenge to write 50,000 words in 1 month.
Okay, yes, I have read about that. I have a lot of friends that do it and it stresses me out. So, because I was like, they're like, why don't you just do this? And that way, that one book that you're still, I'm like, I just feel like I'm not good with that type of deadline on myself. Do you love that? Is that more responsive for your writing?
I am a deadline person, but I do loose NaNoWriMo. So this year I was already working on a book for a deadline and I just set it to be the end of November. So I had extra time, but I'm trying to be in like extra crunch mode now and just saying that I'm doing NaNoWriMo when I'm really nowhere near that horrific daily word count. But yeah, I have authors come on that say that they're like, oh no, I do it every year. And I had one person who I think said that they wrote 100,000 words in a month. And I was like, that's so much. That's amazing. But yeah.
I will sit there and I'll say, this week I'm going to write 5 pages each day. And I tend to do that more than words. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. And then also one of the ones that like, I like to clear the deck. like get up, work out in the morning, and then I will just write for 8 or 10 hours straight if I can clear that kind of time. And then that's where I get really lost in the story and so much comes out. And I know other people are more disciplined. Like they'll say, I'm going to write from 6 to 8 and then do my day job, or I'm going to write from 6 to 8 at night or whatever, and they have a very like more small chunks and they like that. I'm one of those people. Like, sometimes I'll just like say, oh, I'm going to be out of town this weekend or something, so that I can just spend the whole weekend just writing. Because when I get cut when I'm in the flow of it, and sometimes I'm sure you know this too, when you start writing, it's gonna be like 4 o'clock and then all of a sudden it's 8 o'clock because like you're so in there.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I know writers have different things that they can do and how they make it work. But no, if I had to do 50,000 in 1 month, I feel like that would just stress me out.
Oh, it's very stressful. It's fun, but it's very stressful. So you mentioned that you're a big reader. Have you ever read a book so good that it like completely changed your writing or the way that you viewed your writing?
That's tricky because since I only just started writing, in like 2000, right? Like really like writing, every book I read, I feel like makes my writing better now, because then I'm like, oh, wait a second, I didn't do this. Oh, I do this better. I do that. So I read completely differently than I did before. And I would just be like, if it was fiction and I was just reading for fun, I would be like, oh, this book is boring, or oh, this book is fantastic. But I wouldn't really analyze why I felt like that. Whereas now I think I look at it and I say, oh, the dialogue there's not enough dialogue, or there is, and it's just, my personal taste. It's completely subjective. But I also will look to see things, I can start to see little ticks that writers have, that they might do the same thing. And, sometimes they're just cute and they don't bother me at all. But it is a different way of reading now than it was before. And like I said, I tend to read nonfiction for work and, life. I'm about to read a nonfiction book that a friend wrote about democracy. That's my next nonfiction one. But I'm also reading A Well-Behaved Woman, right? Which is like basically The Gilded Age on HBO is based off of it, because a friend of mine gave it to me. She's like, if you need something that just like, for fun. And then I'm going to be reading some science fiction coming up that's in my next. So it's just kind of like a circular thing. And then also like books because I've always read. So it's so hard for me to say even what is my favorite book, because I'm horrible at it. Like sometimes I'm like, what's your favorite song? The last song I heard on the radio. Like that's so unfair to the other million songs.
I totally get that though, where you're it's because when you get asked questions like that, sometimes it just all flies out and it's like, I don't know. I like all of it.
Yeah. A lot of times too, I'll say like my favorite writers, because that's easier, like a Kingsolver and Carl Hyacin and Bukowski, because I can't like even to try to think of what book I like the best of theirs, that like stresses me. Like I was like, again, it's my mood, like, oh, and then that's not really fair to the books. Or you can go back to childhood or go forward. And then there's like Pride and Prejudice books I reread. So it's just, or
you love something sometimes because of nostalgia, but you wouldn't necessarily choose it now, but it's still your favorite book because you read it as a kid, or you want to like this book because of whatever reason or something. I fully get that. I always
are you like been a reader your whole life?
Oh yes, always.
And you're a writer now, so like it just, yeah.
I always tell people it's why I ask the questions on the show, because I couldn't answer them. Not a single one. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. This has really been fantastic.
I appreciate it. This has been really fun.
I just have one last question, and that's, what do you have coming up?
So The Aftermath will be published in spring of 2024, 5 years after the shooting, still part of the Impact series. My website is www.ckwestbrook.com. And if anyone wants to see, then I'll have a pre-order. And when I know the publication date, that'll all be there. And if anyone wants to join my newsletter, they can do that there as well. And it has all my socials. And then after that, I don't know when these two books I'm working on right now are going to be published, hopefully in 2024, but we'll have to wait and see.
That is fantastic. Everyone, please go back all of these amazing books and keep an eye out for anything that you're doing in the future. I know that I will be, and I would love to have you on the show if you'd like to come back on. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm CK Westbrook.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The
end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.